Right, good morning, everybody. Yeah, happy to be here, and want to slightly shift gears, still in the area of clinical surveillance, but like to focus more on the industry perspective and more on the post-market clinical surveillance aspects. First question that comes to mind is what is post-market surveillance? And there's also a lot of talk about clinical follow-up, clinical surveillance. I want to talk about the requirements for post-market clinical surveillance, touch a little bit on the current medical device directive, and also give you a slight outlook as much as I can. I mean, everything is still on the flow related to what's coming up in the future, or what might come up in the future. And then also refer to the MEDEF that Dr. Higgins already mentioned to us, and also touch a bit on what is in the ISO 13485 that speaks to post-market clinical surveillance. So the elements of post-market surveillance, I think Dr. Higgins already managed a plan, and that's a plan for a trial. In the post-market surveillance phase, also a plan for how industry, how we as a company plan to perform those surveillance. Vigilance is a major aspect of it, trend reporting. We're now also required to report even increasing trends of complaints. Literature review, again, something that is relevant in the pre-market phase, but also very relevant in the post-market phase. Registries are one of the tools that industry can use to gather data from products that are in the market. And then, of course, also studies, so-called post-market studies with CE mark devices in Europe to see how this product really performs in the market when it's used more broadly, when it's used not only by a selected group of experts that you might involve in your pre-market trials, but also used by doctors that are not so very experienced with this type of use of the device or the procedure. Then finally, I also want to touch on some challenges for industry to meet all those requirements, especially with a little look into, or beyond Europe, into the international environment, because the requirements are not really all the same. Let's start with a little bit of a definition of what's post-market clinical follow-up or surveillance. And well, there's an expectation that a post-market follow-up is a continuous process, so it's not something that you just do once and then stop it and put it to file, but it's an ongoing process, and there is this requirement to have a post-market surveillance plan. So as a manufacturer, I'm supposed to develop a plan, have some thoughts, what do I plan to do to collect data to see how my device performs in the market. It should be a proactive measure, so it's not sufficient to just sit there and wait for complaints to come in and then look at the data, but you're supposed to develop some tools to proactively look for data to find out how the device performs. And there's this focus on the entire lifespan of the device. Obviously, if I put a new product on the market, I'm really interested, if this is a new technology, to find out how is this technology perceived by my surgeons or by the users. How is this performing? Are all the assumptions that I make about my device and its performance correct? Now, this interest might decrease a little bit over the lifetime of the device. If the technology is no longer so new, I mean, that interest goes down, but still there is expectation that as an industry we follow the device, we monitor, because even though you might understand your technology better and better over time, maybe the practice might change. Practice in an operating room might change. Other technology might kick in. Other devices might get into use, and that can have a significant impact on the performance of your own device. So to capture all those effects, it's important to really follow the device over the whole lifespan. Looking a little bit into the requirements, again, also Medical Device Directive and extends the clinical part, spells out that there is the requirement to actively update the clinical assessment with data from post-market surveillance. So this clinical assessment, again, is nothing that we just compile once, submit to our notified body, they perform an assessment, CE certificate is issued, and that's it. But the clinical assessment is supposed to be done on a regular basis. Now, there's no fixed time frame, but I think in industry, common practice is about an annual review. That might vary depending on the complexity of the technology or the device and depending on your knowledge about this technology. But it's clear there is this requirement to really continuously update the clinical assessment. The clinical assessment needs to be updated. Also, of course, the risk assessment needs to be updated on a regular basis. And all that is then input to the overall assessment. Post-market surveillance data should be considered, and that can come from complaints, from events, but also from literature that is published about the use of your specific device, but also literature that's published about equivalent devices, other devices that might use the same technology, competitor devices. Because if something goes wrong on that end, likelihood that something might go wrong with your device if you're using the same technology is pretty high. And again, the MDD also has this requirement to have a post-market surveillance plan, at least for every product family. Speaking out of experience, this is one point during notified body audits that's always stressed. Notified bodies want to see the plan and then the data that goes with it. There's an additional requirement, which is the one to comply with the state of the art. Also important, sometimes a big challenge for industry, because imagine you have a product out there that's been on the market for 20, 25 years. Of course, you might want still this product to be in the market because it's performing well, there's still demand for it. It's maybe on the lower cost side compared to your used technology, but then you're in the situation where you constantly have to ask yourself, is this product and the technology still representing state of the art? And if you come to the conclusion at one point, no, it's no longer state of the art, when you probably have to take a hard decision. And just to give you one example out of my world, we're in the area of ophthalmology, and at the end of the presentation I'll be showing you some of our products. So in the very old days, if a patient developed a cataract, then your natural lens gets colored, so light doesn't transmit very easily anymore. So that prevents an obstacle from clear vision. And what the people, the doctors in the old days did, they just removed this lens by injecting a needle and just pushing the lens to the back of the eye. Of course, you can't see very sharply anymore, but at least you can see but you can orient in your environment. You see somebody's approaching me, or you can have a kind of a minimum vision, better than the situation before. Today, you treat this disease with phaco machines, even with laser technology. You implant intraocular lenses and have a perfect outcome. So now, if you're a manufacturer of those needles that were used to push the lens to the back of the eye, it's probably very hard to justify saying this is still state of the art. But this technology is still used in some parts of Africa. So it's not that this is so out of scope that these devices are no longer used. They are used, well, probably and hopefully, luckily, not in Europe. But this is one example where we say, hey, I need to look at my technology and check, is this state of the art? How do I do that? I do literature screening. I do, of course, my clinical assessments on an ongoing basis. Also important, I do it for all classes of devices. That's another challenge, I think, especially for small manufacturers. If I think about a small company that produces maybe surgical knives or clamps or, say, easy products, they still are required to have a clinical assessment. That looks different than a clinical assessment for an artificial heart valve. Obviously, it's maybe not that extensive, but it needs to be there. And it's supposed to focus on safety of the product and effectiveness, and in the end, it needs to come up with a conclusion about the risk-benefit ratio. Another proposal coming from the suggestions for the new medical device regulation is that, again, post-market clinical follow-up should be performed, should be done according to a plan, so that stays. And specifically general methods and procedures for gathering clinical experience and feedback from users, screening of literatures should be base of that. So this is something that will not go away, that will be kept also with the new regulation. And there is something in the proposed regulation that now encourages the notified bodies to specifically look at this clinical post-market data and follow-up data every 12 months. So this is the first time I see a date or a period mentioned, how frequently this should be done. Obviously in line probably with the annual audits, which makes sense. MEDEV 2.12.2 defines post-market clinical follow-up studies and the plan, so everybody is not sure about what is a post-market clinical follow-up plan or a study, can look at those definitions. And also ISO 13485 has some elements that relate to clinical post-market follow-up. Because it says known risks, for example, from literature or event reporting need to be addressed in the risk management process and have to be considered in the clinical assessment. So also there you have a link to clinical post-market assessment. Remaining risks need to be addressed in the labeling, and in the end, the medical benefit needs to outweigh remaining risks. So that's the well-known risk-benefit ratio. What are the elements of a post-market clinical surveillance or follow-up? I think the new regulations clearly focus on clinicals, on clinical assessment, but also on clinical follow-up. And I already said there is a focus on an ongoing approach to do that exercise. It says the post-market clinical follow-up should be conducted for every device and has basically to consider data from equivalent devices, but also in case this is not sufficient from your own device. But it's important to not look only at your device in the post-market phase for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Data should be reviewed at regular intervals, and the plan that you come up as a manufacturer should define the frequency of those reviews, should define who is the person, or better, who is the group of people that looks at the data, assesses it, and draws the conclusion. Dr. Higgins already said these people need to be qualified to do the job. And it should also define the trending methodology, and should define at which point you consider a trend to be significant, and then probably take some action. The plan should also tell you where to look for data, so the source of data, and should be proportional to the risk of the device. I mean, again, very much in line with what you said, you need to apply some common sense. I mean, if I'm producing some very simple low-risk devices, I don't need to create a monster of a clinical post-market follow-up plan. But if I'm really entering the field of new technology with high-risk devices, with implantable devices, of course I need to put much more effort into developing this plan and executing the plan. So these are here just some sources of data input: complaint handling, vigilance report, literature, registries. From my experience, a very good source, a solid source of information, and also feedback from regulators or from the notified bodies. Get a little view to the upcoming new regulation. I think Eurosystem, there will be a European system for kind of a harmonized system for notification and evaluation of incidents and field safety corrective actions. I think this focus on the incidents is probably a good thing, because every company anyway is supposed to have that system and can provide input to it, so it's pretty low cost for industry. The challenge of that, if you just focus on this, is it's very reactive. It's just looking at complaint data that somebody sends to you. So the harm is already done, so it's not so easy to see trends, so it's pretty late in the game. There are some other options, like looking at published materials, attending conferences, which companies anyway do, collecting data that are presented there. You look at journals. That's a relatively easy and cheap way for industry to collect data. You get access to worldwide data. Again, it's data on things that happened in the past, so it's pretty reactive. And the data are typically limited and pretty heterogeneous. Then you get into the area of papers published by or about studies. Of course, the quality depends here. It's dependent on whether this is a single-center study, multi-center study. Advantages here: quality of data typically very high, so you get value for the money, but typically you don't get a lot of efficacy data. Small-scale single-arm studies, another option. So you see we're getting more and more into the area of taking more efforts to get data, but it also gets more and more complicated and more costly. It's especially in the area of post-market follow-up, certainly not common practice to do these studies. But again, applying common sense, it might be an option, maybe a necessity, if you're in a situation where you developed completely new technology and you and maybe also others have very limited experience with that technology or the device. There is this general question: when does a company have to do a real post-market clinical follow-up study? Now we're in the area of doing studies with CE-marked devices. And well, the answer to that can be if there is a residual risk that you have not yet addressed by any other means. You can examine long-term performance and safety, hopefully not safety, because you're supposed to have proven that your product is safe before you get the CE mark, before you apply the CE mark. And you can also examine through these studies the performance of your device in a much more representative population of users and patients, because it makes a big difference if some experts use the device on a selected group of patients versus the broad use of your device with unexperienced doctors and all kinds of patients. Of course, if you perform post-market clinical follow-up studies, you need to be able to justify it, because those studies also do represent a certain burden and sometimes some risks for the patient, so there should be also good reasons for performing studies. Also, now from an industry perspective, if there is this call from the regulators to do more and more clinical studies, I would say in principle, yes, it's a good thing to do more trials to gather more data from the real use of your device, but you need to apply that common sense, because you don't necessarily want to run big trials and expose a lot of patients to the risk if there is not high expected value from the data that you gain. I think I will quickly run over that because we're slowly running out of time here. Roll-off notified body, I think we can skip because it has already been mentioned. There are some challenges for the industry to run those trials, and some of them are country by country of different requirements. Solution to that could be more harmonization, more harmonized standards. Other challenges are simply cultural challenges, where you get a lot of data from maybe countries like the UK, where people provide feedback, and you get little data from other countries, like in the Middle East. People are, from a cultural point of view, not so open sharing their criticism about the use of your device with you. So there's some heterogeneity in the system. Language barrier, I think we mentioned. I think I will maybe just quickly come to the last few slides here to show you a little bit about what are the products that we put on the market and where we apply those post-market clinical strategies to. You're basically offering three groups of products. One group, which we call the corneal product group, represents products that are used to clean and to make comfortable the use of contact lenses. So it's eye drops, it's multi-purpose cleaning solutions. A second group, which is the refractive group, this is the group of products that are laser products that you use to correct refractive errors in the eye for those patients that want to get rid of their glasses. And then the third group is in the cataract business, that is treatment of cataract that involves products that are used to remove a cataract, a lens, and also implantable lenses, intraocular lenses that are then implanted to give the patient perfect vision again. We're active worldwide with manufacturing at different places, distribution everywhere. And just to show you some of those pictures, here you can see those intraocular lenses. They are of the size of a 1 cent coin, basically, with these little, it's called haptics to anchor them in the monofocal IOLs that give you a sharp vision in the distance, but you also have multifocal IOLs that work like those glasses that have different sharp vision points, so you can get rid of your reading glasses with them as well. We even have accommodating IOLs. These are machines and equipment that you use during the operation when you implant the intraocular lens. And this is just a picture of the lasers, pretty big machines, so capital equipment, and some of the eye drops. I want to close with one statement Albert Einstein once made. He said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, and that's my hope for the medical device regulation. I hope that we don't end up with a monster of process that will be a huge challenge for all medical device manufacturers, and maybe a challenge that can no longer be mastered by smaller companies that also, of course, are expected to follow the process. But on the other side, I think it's also time to improve and fine-tune some of the regulations that have been in place for quite some time and prove to be successful overall, but there's always room for improvement. So hopefully we will end up with a system that is simple, manageable, but not simpler than that. Thank you very much.
Dr. Menzel, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Considering time, I suggest we take time for one question. If there one question from the floor? No? Well, it's been very clear. Thank you very much. Does Twitter generate a question for us? Okay.
There's one question.
You gave the example with the needle concerning the prior art. What about the technology used? If the function of the equipment doesn't change, but there should be new technology inside, is that also required?
Well, I think there is this general requirement to look at is your product still state of the art. I think there's nothing wrong with the needle, even though it's been on the market for a long time. Technology moved on. There are alternative technologies, but your needle probably might still work very well. So I think a needle as such can probably still be placed on the European market. The question is, of course, would any surgeon still perform that kind of operation with it? The answer is probably no. But your question is more focused on
the implementation, so the equipment used to implement the function. So the functionality remains the same, the user manuals remains the same, but the internals of the device maybe could change to more.
So it's a new technology, maybe, I don't know, maybe no new features, but a new way of providing or delivering those features. I mean, that would be development of the state of the art and probably a new product. I mean, I think what a manufacturer would have to prove is that the technology that works inside of that device doesn't, let's say, delivers the same function, so the product is still efficient, and the technology inside doesn't impose additional risks. And if there are additional risks, you need to look at those risks, minimize them, and in the end still come to the conclusion the benefits outweigh the risks. So I think that's the...
So actually only if the new technology reduces the risks on the existing products, then you are mandatory to modify it.
I'm not sure if it exclusively needs to reduce it. I think the balance needs to be such that the benefits in the end outweigh the risks. I think if you add risks but no benefits, I'm not sure if it's going to work.
That's a general statement about the device.
I mean, in reality, you change something and you add some benefits. You can treat different patients with it, or you have better outcomes, and at the same time you add also some risk. And that's perfectly fine. You just in the end look at your balance. Did you ideally add a few more benefits compared to the risks that you added? I think there is no such thing like a 100% safe device with no risks. I mean, if you add benefits, you typically add risks.
Thank you.
Interesting discussion, but I think we cut it short here, and I'd like to move on to the next presentation. We started with a competent authority perspective, then an industry perspective, and now we get to a notified body perspective.